Hello and welcome to another episode of Eat Smoke Drink. Today I am doing an episode on a question I've been asked a few times. Does whiskey go off? Does whiskey go off in the bottle? The question is a very interesting one. Does it go off or not? What's your definition of going off? So let me get into that. Yes and no. So whiskey will oxidize like any other beverage, like any other thing, it'll oxidize. When you have a bottle and it's probably around about 2/3 to half, I think it's okay. You can leave it in the bottle and it's totally fine. But what you'll find is actually whiskey progresses in the bottle. So this is, a lot of people don't know this. A lot of people will leave their whiskey collection, they'll open 20 bottles and they'll leave that much in the bottle thinking it's going to be alright. When you've got that much whiskey in your bottle, in 2 or 3 weeks, it's probably going to go pretty flat. You're not going to taste much of it, it's going to oxidize. And I would recommend pouring it into a sample bottle or a smaller bottle where you have minimal air. Then you can keep that quality of that whiskey. But it also depends on the alcohol level of your whiskey and the type of whiskey. So for example, if you've got a whiskey that's 60% or 65%, then it has more buffer oxidation versus original flavor and slowing the progression. If you've got a bottle at 42%, or which is frequently common, 40 to 43% common for distillery bottlings, you have half, that should be okay. But don't expect to have the same experience when it's half or when you pour it from full. It does breathe and it does oxidize. So I would recommend, if you're very, very particular in that, then once it reaches about half, put it into a smaller bottle and just label it, or at least expect that it will change in flavor over time. You want to do an experiment, what you can do is when you first open a bottle, pour some in a 50 ml sample with pretty much no air in the top, and then once you deplete your bottle and it gets to about that much, and you leave it there for a few weeks, a couple of months, taste it both side by side. The flavor difference is apparent. And that is why in my reviews you will see sometimes I have an empty bottle and I have a small sample bottle that I'm pouring from, because in our tastings, if I have leftovers that I want to take home, I don't want it to oxidize in the container, so I put it into a bottle straight away so I can keep that original flavor as much as physically possible, which generally, if you have no air, then you'll get pretty close to it. Then reviewing it is more accurate. Now, what oxidizes more? In my experience, generally speaking, it's a general rule and it's not always the case. The lower the alcohol, the faster it'll oxidize. The higher the alcohol, the more buffer you have. But in my experience as well, heavily peated whiskies and very, very harsh, challenging whiskies has a lot more progression potential in the bottle. So for example, if you have yourself an independently bottled Laphroaig by Adelphi, for example, or maybe Signatory Vintage, they're usually 50s, 60s in percent, right? When you have a few drams and you have a little bit more air in there, you close it. If you don't like it the first time, then sometimes after 2 or 3 months, 1, 2, 3 months in the bottle, it actually changes a little bit and the flavor comes to its own. So I've noticed that whiskies like Glenelgan, Mortlach, Laphroaig, Ardbeg, heavy whiskies progresses. Not necessarily better, but different, just as good, sometimes for the worse. So for heavily peated whiskies, I find that they progress. Not necessarily better, but just different. But in some cases, you first open a bottle, maybe it's 58 or 62%, something that's been distilled in a worm tub, that's been made in a worm tub, like a Mortlach, and you go, oh, that is just heavy and harsh, and it just hits you in the face. And you open it, you let some air in, and then it lets it breathe, and then it becomes a lot more tapered and mellow, and it actually improves over time. But once again, when it gets to the bottom, it will oxidize rapidly in the bottle, and so I always try to put it in a small container. So look, not everyone does this, but when I open a bottle and I think to myself, wow, that is exceptional, an OCD of mine is to put it into a sample bottle, I label it and keep it aside, so maybe in a couple of years time I can revisit it again and in its original glory, original format and taste. But look, I don't have many of those bottles, but only the very exceptional ones I will put into a bottle and keep it aside if I have some left over anyway. So when you see me pouring from a sample bottle with the bottle lying on its side, that's the reason. It's because I you know, I want to stop it from oxidizing. So yeah, so it does go off in the bottle, lighter Speyside, Highland, or anything that's kind of 40-45%. If you've got halfway or a third of the bottle, it will actually oxidize a lot to the point where it goes flat. When you go to a bar and you ask for a particular whiskey, and then they take the bottle out and there's only been that much, just look at the bottle. Is it dusty? Does it look like it's been sitting there for months and months? If it has, stop it. Don't take it, take another, because you're not going to get the experience from that bottle. Just a little insight, and thank you very much for watching. If you have any questions for me, please message me on Instagram, ask a question on YouTube, ask a question on my Facebook. I'm more than happy to answer things, and if I don't know the answer, which, you know, we don't know everything, then I will investigate and you know, make sure that I've got the answer for you. Thank you, and see you again. Poor, you know, like sometimes we photograph. It does like people today, eh?
You just want people. You just want people.